office in the Democracy Now! Studios in New York. Here's a conversation. Amy Goodman, welcome to The Public.
It's great to be with you, Kevin.
What comes across in watching Democracy Now! Or for people who've seen you speak at events or read your books is just how passionate you are in the importance of public media and the importance of media generally, but especially independent voices. And one of the metaphors you most often use when talking about the importance of the media is you say that the media is like a kitchen table that spreads across the country where we all gather around as citizens and discuss the big important issues of the day, life and death, war and peace, all the things that confront us. And I want to get to the bigger issues of media and the role media plays in democratic society. But first, I want to ask you a bit about where your sense of the media comes from, because it sounds like growing up, you had quite a sort of lively sense among your family of media and democracy and community involvement. What was it like sitting around your kitchen table at the Goodman's home? Was there an active debate going on there?
Constantly. My friends were always amazed that we actually ate and argued as we talked, as opposed to a quiet meal. I mean, why bother eat if you're not with a group of friends or family having a debate about some issue? And sitting in my office, which I don't often do, I can't even believe I have one. And I'm looking at a picture of my father, and he looks a little like Peter Sellers. And he was very famous in the railroad stations of Long Island because he was, well, I guess you could say a poster boy. There's a photograph of him on this big poster. He's wearing a stethoscope and his white medical jacket. And in the stethoscope is a mushroom cloud, and it says, "Your doctor is worried." And it was put out by Physicians for Social Responsibility.
And you actually have a copy right here in your office.
It's hanging in my office. And I remember him saying when he came back from this photo shoot that the most difficult thing was not smiling. And then my mother is right there as well. And I've lost both my parents. They've both died. But my mother is a wonderful person who started the first Sane Freeze, a peace group chapter in Long Island. And she also taught women's history and literature at local colleges where I grew up. Her class was extremely popular. It was continuing ed. So, the firefighters, the cops, the truck drivers would take her class because, they'd see the list. If you get credits, you could get paid more. And, they'd see the list, and then they'd see women's literature. They'd think, oh, chick lit.
They thought this was going to be a bird course.
That's right. Well, they thought it was going to be, a walk in the park. And, in a sense, it was a beautiful park. But my mom introduced them to Toni Morrison and Virginia Woolf and so many other great writers. And soon these guys would be bringing their wives. It's the beginning of the women's consciousness raising era and modern day feminism. They'd be bringing their daughters. Oh, is this why, this what they're thinking about or talking about that I have no understanding of, they would say. And by the end of her classes, they would be packed to the rafters. And then she became a social worker to work with people, help them work out their problems. But my parents were incredible role models, as were my grandparents. And I have 3 brothers, and the kitchen table was where we gathered. Morning, we'd be racing around. Evening, occasionally we'd come home for dinner, one or all of us. And then late night especially, that bowl of cereal before we went to sleep, that was important.
And what sort of issues do you remember discussing at the time?
Oh, I mean, all the world's issues. Well, my dad was an ophthalmologist. And I don't know if you use the word activist at that time, but he and my mother were deeply concerned about community and making the place we live better. And he headed a task force to integrate the schools of our community. We were a diverse community, but because of de facto segregation, depending on where you lived, meant where you went to school. And he headed a task force to integrate the schools. So if you were in first grade, you all went to a particular school that had the first grade, so we were all together. But that took a lot of work. And I would go with him. I was in, say, 5th grade, but I would go with him to the auditoriums and cafeterias of the schools of our community, 1,000 screaming parents. And I would watch as he judiciously brought our community to a more just place. And my older brother, we were all involved in this newspaper in high school and junior high school.
Well, I want to get to that, but first, is it true that he received death threats over this? Like this was a really big issue.
Yes, it was a big issue where we grew up, as it was in places all over the country. But my older brother was covering this while my dad was doing this, right? So he would be in a study. Yes, he received death threats. It was very serious. And my brother would be eavesdropping his ear against the door to hear my father talking. And then he would say, I got a scoop, to put into the school newspaper. And my father would come out and say, no, that was off the record. You had no right to listen. And my brother would be running down the stairs shouting, censorship, censorship. That's where I got my sense of justice in the media. But I really do see the media as a way to make the world a more just place. And that very much shaped what I think our role is as journalists. I mean, in high school, it was holding the principal accountable.
So you worked at, you were the editor of your high school newspaper. What is
Maroon
it?
Echo.
The Maroon Echo.
Maroon Echo.
And
with others. And, we'd write editorials demanding that the principal take a stand on something or change his ways. And then just going from high school on, it was just, going to a bigger stage to hold those who had even more power accountable.
But what sort of issues do you remember holding the principal accountable on? Were there any that really stuck out for you?
I can't remember right at this moment, but I remember some issues I was involved with. In my day, it was girls being able to be in shop, not just in home ec, not just cooking and sewing, but being able to build things. That's what I wanted to do, but I wasn't allowed. It was bringing a speaker into the school who provided abortions very early on and being told that we wouldn't be allowed to do that. And, realizing what free speech meant.
And is it true your brother David, he even had a sort of a family newspaper, like Dave's Press, something like that?
You've done a lot of research. Yes. My younger brother David, who I've written 3 books with, he was my role model. He had a newspaper when he was, I can't remember, 8, 9, 10 years old, 7 years old. And he got this old-fashioned Xerox machine where you press down and the image would burn into the image of the next piece of paper. And it was sort of a glorified family calendar. And then he wrote like something on this particular Wednesday. It said something like "Mom hits Amy," or "Mom spanks Amy." And then my mother put her foot down and she said, "No dirty laundry is aired in this newspaper." On the editorial pages, David would write against the war in Vietnam. And my grandfather would weigh in and say what he thought. And then David would write back and say, "Dear Grandpa, thank you for being the first subscriber of my newspaper. But I think your views on the Vietnam War are stupid." And then my uncle would weigh in, my great uncle, and say, "Sal, how could you attack your grandson in this way?" And it was like that kitchen table just playing out in the newspaper. I was the envelope stuffer, and we would put the newspaper under everyone's door in our house. We all had to pay our subscriptions, though. It was something like $0.01 a year.
And you were in charge of collecting the fees, I read.
Yes, I probably was, and I'm not sure if I forgave people if they didn't pay. But David needed to be able to eat, not that he had to pay for his meals. I had a lending library in my room. So my entire library was all organized, alphabetized, and there were little cards, and if you came in, you could take out a book, and then you'd have to return it. So books and newspapers, journalism, music, these were very important in our lives. When my parents were moving from our beloved house in Brightwaters, New York, we were selling off some of the books. And these books are friends. My dad had MS. He was in a wheelchair. And, the doors were opened and the ad was put in the paper. So everyone was coming to buy the books, the encyclopedias, whatever. Everyone was in the house. And all of a sudden we looked around and my mother said, "Where's Dad? Where's my father?" And my father was following people around in his scooter. And whenever they would pull a book off the shelf, he would say, "Excuse me, can I see that book, please?" And he would take it and he would put it on his lap. And then he had a motorized scooter. And then he would go to the next person and say, "Can I see that book just before you take it, please?" And he would pile it on his lap. And we found him in the next room, in the living room, his back to everyone, with a huge stack of books, like almost he had rolled with all of the books. And we said, "Dad, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm buying these myself." He would not let his friends go, but we totally understood. It was very hard to let go. It was not just the wallpaper. It was the landscape of our house. It was how we lived. We lived and breathed those books.
So you graduate from high school and then you go to Harvard, and suddenly you're in, I guess, the middle of, basically the training ground for the establishment, which, seeing the path you've taken so often against the establishment, it seems quite remarkable in retrospect. And so you were involved in a campus newspaper there, like a feminist newspaper that you helped revive?
Yes, we helped revive a newspaper called Seventh Sister. And my first big piece in the first issue was an expose on sexual harassment on campus. And I interviewed all of these professors talking about how they treated their female students differently from their male students. And it was also about sexual assault, which continues to be a major issue that rages through campuses in the United States today, and I'm sure everywhere else. But, being at this institution that so represented the establishment and future leaders of the establishment, I remember one night getting a call from my mother, and she said, "Where are you?" I said, "Well, I just came from the library." She said, "Then why did I see a picture of you with your fist in the air, like shutting down the administration building?" I said, "Ma, that was last night," because that was around South Africa, the university divesting from businesses that worked in South Africa. So
you were actively involved with the sort of movements on campus.
Yes, there was called SASC, the South African Solidarity Committee. And, the group was raising very important issues, going to the core of the endowment of the university, and had the biggest endowment. How could we be supporting this brutality in South Africa? But, I was there for a few years, and it seemed like a very expensive way to protest because I was spending so much time critical of what was happening there. So I then went up to Maine, to College of the Atlantic, and I took some courses there. There in Maine, I think, is really where I really learned to critically think. And then I ultimately came back.
Well, why did you leave in the first place? Did you feel, was it anything to do with the atmosphere at Harvard, or did you just want something different?
Well, I was spending so much time protesting. I didn't have to pay for that. But I came back because I got very interested. We ran a whole grain bakery collective in Maine, made thousands of loaves a week for the grocery stores, co-ops, bodegas of Maine. I would drive this little pickup truck 14 hours in a day to deliver all the bread that we had baked and the cookies and the granola. And we had a restaurant as well, a macrobiotic restaurant. And
this is you and some friends from campus?
Collective. Yeah, a collective of people. And we're very serious about it. Very much connected me to the whole food chain, where we get the wheat, the weather, what it meant. And I was very interested in the ecology of nutrition, the biochemistry of nutrition. And I always thought that the bakery would be the profit-making arm of a kind of educational center. But I was so covered in flour for a number of years, and I said, we're never going to get to that educational center because we're so busy baking. One day we got a call. It was around 5 to noon, and I picked it up, and the guy said, "I'd like to put in an order for buns, whole wheat buns." And so I said, "Okay, would you like 6? So would you like a dozen? Would you like 1? And so he said, "Well, actually, I would like to put an order for 10,000 buns a week." And I said, "Who is this?" And so he said, "My name is Ken Raffel, and I own Arby's." Arby's is, I used to think it stood for roast beef, ARBY, but it stood for Raffel Brothers. And Royal Crown bought the chain, but they had the original 3 stores in Maine. So I said, "Oh my goodness, well, wait a second, what time is it?" And he said, it's 5 to noon. So I said, could you call me back at 5 after 1 because I have to be at the post office at noon. I had made the sign that I would carry each day. It was sort of a peace sign, and it said peace on earth. I would hold it in front of the post office, and it would just generate great discussions. I'm very much into discussions. And at the time, people went in and out of the post office at lunchtime, so it was the greatest place to have these discussions.
And you did this every day?
Yes.
By yourself, with others?
Sometimes with others and sometimes by myself. But the key was I had to get out there. 10,000 bun order or no. So he said, excuse me? I said, I've got to get out there because I hold the sign at noon. You know, I think it's good to have structure in your life. And he said, I just said that I want to put in an order for 10,000 buns a week. I presume you don't get many orders like that. And you're saying you're going to go off to do this? I said, sir, which is more important, a piece of bread or peace on earth? He said, okay, I'll call you back at 1 o'clock. So he called me back in an hour and he said, did you accomplish it? I said, well, accomplish what? He said, peace on earth. I said, well, that will take more than me and it's going to take all of us, including you. So he said, okay, I'd like to place that order now. So that started our relationship with Arby's.
Such an unlikely relationship.
It is. He said he would come up to inspect our bakery. It's called the Sunflower, spelled as in flour, you know, baking flour. Sunflower Bakery in Bar Harbor, Maine. And I said, actually, I'd like to come down and inspect your premises. So I went down and we had to seal the deal, you know. And I brought my 6 buns in a bag and I had my felt hat that was covered in flour. And I walked in, there were all the guys at Arby's at a back table. And they said, well, how much are you going to charge? So I said, how much do you pay for those white buns? And so he said something like 0.5 cents a bun. And I said, 0.5 cents a bun. I said, okay, I was going to say 10 cents, but I'll give it to you for 9 cents. And he said, the whole 6-pack? And so I said, well, no, of course not. 1 bun. He said, I told you 0.5 cents, and you're telling me 9 cents. I said, right, well, there's a reason you called us. Organic, whole grain, macrobiotic bun. 9 cents a bun for you. And he said, well, take it.
Really? And so how long?
Huge tractor, double tractor trailer truck would pull up to the Sunflower Bakery each week. And we would have started at sunrise, you know, starting what's called the sponge. It's the barley malt. We didn't use sugar. And we didn't even use honey. The barley malt, the yeast, the water, and the whole wheat flour, organic. And then that would rise, and then more people would come down from the collective to start breaking it up, to start kneading it, to start letting it rise. And then we loaded it into these pizza ovens. But this had to happen many times to get 10,000 buns. And we would be fanning it. And, you know, you can't seal the plastic bag of the buns until it's cool, or else there will be moisture and it will make them soggy. So we had quite a job to do. I'd sometimes try to distract the driver because we wouldn't quite be ready by offering him a DLT sandwich. That's dulse, lettuce, and tomato. Very much like bacon, but far better, far more nutritious. So I did that for a few years, and that was wonderful. And we had a large garden, and that was a lot of the vegetables that we used in our restaurant. But ultimately, I decided to go back to school. I wanted to get a degree. I was majoring in anthropology, and I wanted to learn more about biochemistry and nutrition. So I went back to Cambridge and I started taking some courses at the School of Public Health. And I remember the first class I took, and this was after being away for years and, you know, being covered in barley malt and wheat. And the professor was talking about the myths that sugar was bad for you. The myths that sugar was bad for you. It was the whole hour. And I was so surprised. It was a caricature of a class, of a corporate university setting. And no one was saying anything. They're just writing notes. And at some point I raised my hand and I said something like, but what about cavities? I mean, is there nothing bad about sugar? And I walked out into the hall, and on the wall was a plaque, this wing built by Domino's. You know, so very much, you know, showed where that education was coming from. But I ultimately did my thesis on a drug called Depo-Provera, which is an injectable contraceptive. It's made just of progesterone, and you inject it into a woman's arm once every few months. And it hadn't been approved by the FDA, but it was sent to more than 80 countries in the world, from Upjohn company, which has since been subsumed many times in other corporations, and from Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I was amazed that this drug that had caused cancer in beagles and monkeys, not approved in the United States, could be injected in women everywhere. In Chiang Mai, Thailand, and other places, it would say, this many million women hours it had been tested. But that's like 1 million women for 1 hour. They inject, they go into the mountains, and you never see them again. And I really was looking at how science is used against women, but I couldn't afford to go to any of these places. So I went down to Atlanta, Georgia, to the Grady Charity Hospital, where 10,000 Black women had been injected with Depo-Provera. It had been the beginning of the Black Women's Health Project run by Billy Avery, where they organized because so many women had gotten sick. This is the healthiest years supposed to be of a woman's life, and why would you be getting sick? So I did my thesis and then had to defend it. And at my university, I couldn't find anyone who did this kind of work. For them, anthropology at the time was you go 3,000 years ago or 3,000 miles away, anything to keep you from being an activist.
I think that's socially relevant.
Right. Anthropology makes you an activist. And I think they were trying to sort of dampen that. So they allowed me to get an outside thesis advisor, and I chose Laura Nader, Ralph Nader's sister. She's a professor of anthropology at University of California, Berkeley, but she was on the East Coast, I think at Wellesley or something. And she was a great advisor, but then I had to defend it before my own department. So there were these 3 guys, the head of biological anthropology, cultural anthropology, and archaeology. And I remember how excited I was to be leaving this institution. And my parents had already bought, reservations at the local motel or something for graduation. All my great aunts and uncles and grandparents were going to be there. So this was a big day. So this was serious. This was the last step. And when one of the professors, who at the time smoked a pipe, pushed the thesis back at me and said, "Miss Goodman, do you even know what anthropology is? At best, this is a thesis in sociology, but we can't accept this." And I'm thinking, oh my God, I don't think they can get the reservations, the money back for the reservations. What am I going to do? And he said, "Do you even know what the definition of anthropology is?" So I thought at that moment very quickly, mine better agree with his, or my family's going to be wiped out. So I said, "Well, Professor, what's your definition of anthropology?" And he said, "Well, you shouldn't have to ask this after 4 years at this august institution. But anthropology is the study of someone else's culture as a participant observer. At best, this is sociology. You're looking at your own culture." And so I said, "Actually, I agree with your definition. It's being a participant observer in someone else's culture." And I was looking at the white male corporate practice of science and medicine in the United States. I don't consider myself a part of that. I was looking at you. He took another drag on his pipe and he said, "Carry on." So I graduated.
And did you feel almost like an anthropologist just being at Harvard, or did you have enough of a community that it didn't feel that sort of stark?
Well, that's a good way to put it. I mean, in certain preserves of the place, or in certain areas of the place, certain reserves of the place, I guess. But I did have a community of people, friends to this day. I think everywhere we go, we seek out people who both you can have a similar worldview with or not a similar worldview, but that you care about. And I certainly found that community. And I left there, and it was when I was turning that thesis into a series of articles for the Multinational Monitor, which was run by journalist Alan Nairn and Ralph Nader, that I heard WBAI for the first time on the radio in my house that I grew up in. I just happened to hear it, and I was just blown away by this non-commercial station. I had not listened to the radio growing up. I heard the station and, all the myriad accents, all the glory and horror of New York. And I thought, wow, that is an amazing place to be. And I went to take a graduate class in biochemistry at the City College in New York called Hunter College. And down the hall, they were teaching a radio documentary course. So I slipped in there. And the professor was a producer at WBAI, that station I had been listening to. And I said, oh my God. And so I went up to him afterwards, and he said I could apprentice with him. And he was starting a show called Investigations. He was Australian. And so that was the beginning of, we walked over that night to WBAI. And in a sense, I've really never left.
I was amazed to read that even after all of this, like basically for your thesis, you were doing journalism, basically. And then you did,
that was their criticism. Part of their criticism of the thesis was that it was too journalistic. I said, well, why is that a criticism?
Yeah, it seems like that is anthropology in a way, just a different sphere.
Yeah. I bumped into my older brother when I was trying to decide what I would major in. I remember how important this was to me at the time. It was important to everyone. I couldn't imagine what I would major in college. It seemed way too early to decide. I could do science. I could do social studies. I could do English. I'd like to do Chinese. I could do East Asian studies. I could do history of science. And I have to choose one, and this is going to determine the rest of my life. And so I was on the street, and I was agonizing, and my older brother, Steve, was listening, and he said, okay, then you should major in anthropology. I had to run to the administrative office. I had to decide this in like 5 minutes by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I said,
so you really left it to the last minute.
Like I do everything in my life. And I said, what are you talking about anthropology? It's the one subject I just didn't say to you. I don't even know what anthropology is. He said, well, anthropology is for people who don't know what they want. So I said, perfect. And I ran to the administrative building and I signed up.
What I was amazed is that even after all of this and like all the, Dave's Press and editing your high school newspaper, before you caught WBAI, you weren't planning on going into journalism. You were interested in nutrition or continuing down that road further.
Well, journalism was always a part of my life. It was like breathing. So that just existed as a path of everything that I was doing. But I was interested in many things. And when young people say, should I major in journalism in college? A lot of colleges don't. We didn't have that major in college. I just say you need to get a great education. And that doesn't mean in a conventional institution, but, learn about the world, experience the world. And so there's no contradiction really in my interest in biochemistry or nutrition or the way science and medicine is practiced, the way institutions are set up and who becomes the victims of them, who becomes the inheritors of them, the beneficiaries of them. I think all of that is good training for journalism.
And then as soon as you started at the station, did it feel like obvious, like this is what you wanted to be doing?
I loved doing it. And I love that it was multimedia, that you could be writing and then you go back, you listen in the headphones to a news conference you just recorded. I loved, I could be very distracted. And so this is really bringing together all of your senses. When I was training people, when I was editor in the newsroom of WBAI, I would say when people came back from a news conference, okay, now don't take out your notebook. Just tell me what was most important about this news conference. And they said, well, let me just look. No. I don't want everything to be equal because once you go to your notes, you'll say this was interesting and this was interesting because all those things were. But I want to remember just in your gut, I want you to tell me what you remember. They'll say, well, this mother cried, but I really want to give you the facts. I said, that's where you start. So that's the clip you want. Because really, in a news story, you are telling one important story, a story that you hope someone who's listening will take. And if you have a picket fence in the backyard or you're yelling out the window to your neighbor in an apartment, you want to be able to repeat that story. And so, it involves real people. I grew up on soap operas. I didn't identify with the people in these soap operas. They wore evening gowns in the afternoon and they drank. But at least it wasn't violent. People weren't killing each other. And I was very drawn to serial dramas, and being in people's lives. And I really think we have to use that same formula for news because all of the big foreign policy, domestic policy issues really come down to how it affects individuals and families and communities. And I want to follow those stories because then you get away from ideology. It's how it affects people on the ground. It's not what you think it should do. It's how it does it. And in the United States today, that great sucking sound from the middle class and the poor, the wealth going right to this fraction of a percent of people that are the most powerful in wealth in this country and around the world. How does it affect people on the ground? You can say, well, no, they could have that too. Well, if they don't, I want to show what it is that they're experiencing. And I think that's the power of media. It's storytelling. It's people telling their own stories, or telling those stories if they can't, until they can tell their own.
On that point, one of the things you most often say is the lies cost lives. That if the mainstream media gets it wrong, it's just not an error in storytelling. It causes very real effects. And unfortunately, you've actually had to witness this in a very real way. You were reporting in East Timor, and you witnessed a massacre that you and your colleague Al Nairn were there at the time. This is in 91, I think. And having seen, and this was, with arms that were supplied to the Indonesian military by the United States foreign policy, by United States military aid. And I was wondering, it must be so frustrating to come back. And most of what you read in the newspapers, the New York Times, or just the establishment press, it's talked about in a very abstract way. And even reading it, you don't really get a sense of on the ground that this actually really matters. How did you deal with that? Coming back and to a lot of people, it's just a game. It's just sort of, it's like covering sports almost at times.
Right. But something like that, what happened was such a horrific atrocity. I mean, I went to East Timor with this very brave journalist, Alan Nairn, really learned about East Timor because of Noam Chomsky. He never stopped talking about it from when the Indonesian military invaded East Timor. And it shows the power of someone repeating a story over and over again, this terrible injustice. It was December 7th, 1975, that Indonesia invaded East Timor. Indonesia was one of the most powerful militaries in the world. East Timor had been colonized by Portugal for hundreds of years, but Portugal pulled out. It had declared its independence, and Indonesia did not want a model of independence in its very repressive archipelago of 13,000 islands. It's just a small half island about 300 miles above Australia.
And the president and Kissinger had just met with Suharto, the Indonesian president, the day before the invasion or something like that.
So right before the invasion, President Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger met with the long-reigning dictator Suharto in Jakarta. And as they flew out to meet with another dictator, Marcos of the Philippines, President Ford and Henry Kissinger gave the go-ahead for the invasion. Suharto was scared that he would have the U.S. military aid cut off if he invaded East Timor, because if a country engages in that kind of offensive act, the laws of the United States are you can't continue to provide military aid. But he got the go-ahead from the President of the United States and the Secretary of State. And so as they flew out, the Indonesian military invaded East Timor by land, by air, and by sea. They closed East Timor to the outside world, and they commenced one of the great slaughters of the late 20th century. They killed a third of the population, proportionately larger than what Pol Pot did in Cambodia. Now, in the United States, we knew about what happened in Cambodia because Pol Pot was an official enemy of the United States, so the President and Secretary of State spoke against him, and the media dutifully reported that. Actually, they should have reported that because it was terrible what happened in Cambodia. But in the case of Indonesia, Suharto was an ally of the United States. U.S. corporations were heavily involved with Indonesia. And so the president, whether it was Ford or onto Carter, onto Reagan, Bush, Clinton, didn't matter, Democrat or Republican, they remained allies of the Indonesian regime. They didn't talk about the slaughter in Timor, and the press, sadly, dutifully followed suit. So we went there in 17 years into the invasion, in 1990 and 1991. At the end of October 91, Alan and I went there. We went to the main Catholic church in Dili, the capital of East Timor. The women were wailing at the Mass. We didn't know if it was the standard sorrow of Timor or if something had happened. Afterwards, we learned that the Indonesian military had shot into the church and killed a young man named Sebastião Gomes. Now, the reason we had gone there in 1991 was because the UN for the first time was going to send a fact-finding mission to East Timor. It would be the first time word would get out to the outside world. So scores of young people had taken refuge in the church as the one institution allowed to stand so that they wouldn't be arrested before the delegation came. And so the Indonesian military surrounded this church. Sebastião Gomes and others were inside, and they shot him at point blank range. And when we went outside, we saw the blood on the steps. So the next day, the funeral was held for him, and 1,000 people came out for it, and they followed the family carrying the coffin to the Santa Cruz cemetery. And you'd never seen anything like this in Timor, like no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly, no freedom of press. Yet the people gathered, marched through the streets of Dili, and put up their hands in the V sign, Viva East Timor, Viva Independence, Viva Sebastião. It's not that they knew him, all of them. It's just that they knew that the only institution they had, the Catholic Church, where they could pray and gather, had been violated. We went around the country after that for 2 weeks, and everywhere we heard the same story. The Indonesian military warned people, if you speak to the delegation, we'll kill you after they leave. We've already dug the mass graves to put your bodies in. Bishop Bello, who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize, told us that the line most commonly used was, we will kill your family to the 7th generation. And so within that 2 weeks, we learned that the delegation was not going to come. We later learned that was at the behest of the United States. It was the first time word was going to get out about what was happening. So November 12th, 1991 was the 2-week commemoration of the funeral. And people were so frustrated. The delegation was not going to come. And so they decided to hold a commemoration procession. They went to the Moteal Church, the main flagship church, in the morning where Sebastião was killed. 1,000 people, the priests held the mass outside in the morning. And then the people marched from the church, and now thousands had gathered, and they unfurled banners that they'd hidden in their Catholic school blouses. They were written on bed sheets, and they said things like, why the Indonesian military shoot our church? They appealed to President Bush at the time, George H.W. Bush. They appealed to the UN about the killings to stop them. And we followed these people. Thousands would join from workplaces, from homes, through the streets of Dili. This geography of pain. In every other building, whether it was a police barracks where someone was tortured, or an army base where a Timorese was killed, or even the back of hotels where Timorese women were raped, or in officers' homes where they were held, they marched through this geography of pain, and they made their way to the Santa Cruz cemetery to remember Sebastião. Thousands of people. When we got there, we were asking people, interviewing them, why are you doing this? We'd ask someone, they'd say, for my mother, or for my father, for my village. It was wiped out. And then from the direction the procession had come, hundreds of Indonesian soldiers carrying their USM-16s at the ready position. There were thousands of people in the street. They couldn't escape. There were walls on either side of the road for the cemetery. The soldiers were marching up to 10 to 12 abreast. We decided to walk to the front of the crowd because although we knew the Indonesian military had committed many massacres in the past, they'd never done it in front of Western journalists. Maybe just our presence could head off this attack. So I took my tape recorder out of my bag and I put my headphones on and I held up my microphone like a flag. We'd always had no equipment before because anyone caught talking to a Western journalist could be taken, captured, could be tortured, could be killed. But now we wanted to make clear who we were. Alan put the camera above his head and we walked to the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up carrying their USM-16s. They swept around the corner, swept past us, and without any warning, without any provocation, without any hesitation, they opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. First to go down, a boy behind us, hands up in the V sign, shouting, Viva East Timor. He just exploded. The soldiers came at me. They were waving my microphone in my face as if to say, this is what we don't want. They slammed me to the ground with their rifle butts and boots. Alan got a photograph of them opening fire on the crowd, and they took their USM-16s like baseball bats and they slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. he had thrown himself on top of me to protect me from further injury. So we were laying in the road. Ellen was covered in blood. They were killing everyone around us. They'd now stripped us of everything. And a firing squad of these soldiers, others were killing the protesters, gathered around us. They put the guns to our heads. They were shouting two things. They were saying politique, and they were saying Australia. They were saying that us witnessing this was political. But that is our job as journalists, to go to where the silence is. And they were demanding to know if we were from Australia. We knew how dangerous this was. When Indonesia first invaded East Timor 17 years before, there were 5 very brave journalists who were covering events leading up to the invasion, and they were in a town called Balibo. They lined them up against a house, and they executed them all. The last journalist, Roger East, was in a radio station in Dili the day after the invasion, December 8th, 1975. He was now reporting for the World. They dragged him out of the radio station, and as he shouted, "I'm from Australia," they shot him into the harbor with so many thousands of Timorese. So the Australian government hardly protested the killing of their journalists. We believe because years later, Australia and Indonesia would sign the Timor Gap Treaty, dividing Timor's oil between Australia and Indonesia. Oil is the source of so much pain in the world. And so as we lay there, Ellen covered in blood, we shouted back, "No, we're from America. We're from America." They'd kick me in the stomach when I get my wind back. I would say, "America, America." They finally took the guns from our heads, we believe, because we were from the same country their weapons were from. They would have to pay a price for killing us that they had never paid for killing the Timorese. They moved on. A Red Cross Jeep pulled up. We were able to get into it. The Red Cross driver picked up an old Timorese man. They'd beaten him into a sewer ditch next to us, and each time he put up his hands in the prayer sign, they took the butts of their rifles and they smashed his face. So the driver picked him up, put him in the Jeep. We were driving off, and Timorese came running from all directions, jumped on top of us, on top of the vehicle, hanging off of the spare tire at the back, and we drove like that as a human mass to the hospital. We got to the hospital. The doctors and nurses started to cry when they saw us, not because we were in worse shape than the Timorese, but I think because of what we represent to the people of Timor. 2 things: the sword and the shield. The sword, because all too often the U.S. government uses weapons, like in Australia, like in Afghanistan and Iraq, or gives them to human rights abusing regimes, as in Indonesia. 90% of the weapons used in Indonesia's invasion of East Timor were from the United States. The U.S. military had armed, trained, and financed the Indonesian military. But that's the U.S. government. They also see us as the shield, and that shield was bloodied on that day, and that just deepened their despair. We went into hiding them. I was sure they were going to raid the hospital. This is where the lucky Timorese were. It's hard to use that word, lucky, where incredibly brave young people dragged their brothers or sisters or friends who'd been shot at the massacre site and who are not yet dead. They dragged them to the hospital to be operated on. We went to the bishop's house, Bishop Bello, and there were many hundreds of Timorese taking refuge there. Alan was just covered in blood. Bishop Bello helped me clean Alan up, gave him a new shirt. I took the shirt, his bloody shirt, and wrapped it. He gave me a towel, and I wrapped it around my waist because I thought this would be evidence of what happened. Then we had someone take 18 pictures of us, because if they denied, which we expected, anything happened, well, what happened to us? We thought we had not succeeded in stopping the killing. The Indonesian military killed more than 270 Timorese that day, November 12, 1991. But maybe if we could get out and alert the rest of the world, it's the pressure from outside that would stop the killing. We were able to get to the airport. They'd already raided the hotel. We knew we couldn't go back there. And at the airport, They started shouting when they saw us. It was not clear whether there was a gap in communication between this military at the airport and the massacre site, or if they had truly decided at the massacre site not to kill us. But they let us get on this plane. It was the last plane out that day. We walked on the tarmac toward the plane, and Alan could hardly walk. He had electrical charges going through his body. He'd been beaten so badly, and we didn't want them to see that. We wanted to make sure they didn't see the blood that was pouring out of cuts on his head. It was like a bathing cap of blood. We'd cleaned him up, but under his dark hair. And once it came down again, we were afraid that they would notice. So I kept stopping so that he could catch up. There were soldiers there, and I kept saying, we just want to take one last look at this beautiful country. We got into the plane when the flight attendants closed the door. There were Balinese flight attendants from Indonesia. They gave me a silver bowl of water, and they said, clean him up. We flew to West Timor and then to Bali. In Bali, we were able to connect with the Continental flight. We were able to get on that flight. On Bali, we called the West, and as Alan told news organizations in the West before we got on the plane that there had been this massacre in Timor, I had to keep wiping off the blood off the phone that he would put to his ear with the towel that I had. We got on the plane. The flight attendants of Continental called for doctors. We were going to Guam and then flying to the United States because Guam, there's a naval hospital to help Alan. When we got to Guam, we made sure not to go to the naval hospital because we thought they would cut off all contact. An ambulance from Guam Memorial Hospital picked us up, this little hospital. And even as they were sewing up Alan in the hospital, all the switchboard was filled with, BBC and Voice of America and Washington Post and New York Times. For the first time in 17 years, they were reporting on what happened in Timor. And even as Alan was being sewed up, he was on the phone, and he would stop sometimes to shout in pain, but he would tell the story again. We were then taken by ambulance to a CNN outpost, a cable studio. We had the photographs developed that I had hidden away of us, and we held them up. The military at first, as we expected, denied anything had happened, but what happened to us? And then they said maybe 10 people have been killed, maybe 19, maybe 20, and then the numbers just started going up. They could not deny it anymore. We got onto the flight to the United States. Alan went to the hospital in Washington, D.C., but as soon as he got out, hours later, as they had to re-sew up his head, we held a news conference in the National Press Club, said U.S. weapons were used, described what happened. That was in 1991. A nationwide movement grew up in the United States called the East Timor Action Network, ETAN. In Canada, it was called the East Timor Alert Network. And in the United States, Congress members were getting more calls on East Timor than any other foreign policy issue, and that was a huge deal because it was such a tiny country. But people could understand what this means, defenseless people being gunned down. That was 1991. In 1999, the people of East Timor got to vote for their freedom in a UN-sponsored referendum. I tried to get into East Timor to cover this, and I got caught twice, deported by the Indonesian military. I tried to go through Jakarta. They caught me. The next day, I tried to fly through Bali, Bali. They caught me and they deported me back to Taipei and Taiwan.
Did they give you the official reason, or was it just...
Oh, no, they would just catch me each time going through customs. And finally, the Taiwanese police at the airport said if I didn't fly back to the United States, they would arrest me in Taiwan and they would put me in jail. And I said, but you should be respecting law and order. You should not be upholding this illegal occupation that is taking place. Anyway, I was not able to get in, but Alan was. He was able to fly into Timor. And as usual, incredibly brave reporting as the people of East Timor got to vote for their freedom, and Indonesia burned East Timor to the ground in a sadistic goodbye operation. Alan was the last Western journalist who was reporting from East Timor, and he reported every step of this military assault that killed yet another 1,000 people, and we broadcast it on Democracy Now! For 3 years, the people of Timor were under the rule of the United Nations in a transition government. And then May 20th, 2002, the people of East Timor celebrated their independence, and we were able to get in. Then I came in through Australia. 100,000 Timorese gathered at Tasitolo, a sandy plain outside of Dili. The UN Secretary General Kofi Annan gave a speech. Then Shanana Gusmao, the rebel leader of Timor, who for years had been imprisoned by the Indonesian military, he gave a speech in I don't know how many languages, 4 languages, putting everyone to shame. And then he unfurled the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. And there was this fireworks display. And you could see the light reflected in the tear-stained faces of the people. And it was just such a lesson to us. We were the only live U.S. broadcast that was broadcasting these events. And right about midnight, we were calling Noam Chomsky because he had for so long kept this issue alive. And we asked him, did you ever think this day would come? And he said, honestly, no. I mean, the people of Timor were so much more optimistic. It was amazing how they had held on to every ray of hope, even as hundreds of thousands of them were being killed. And it was a lesson to all of us, whether we are journalists or politicians, bankers, artists, librarians, business people, peace activists, organizers, employed or unemployed. We have a decision to make every day, whether we want to represent the sword or the shield.
I mean, seeing something like that and then transition, I mean, it's so horrific. And I mean, how do you reconcile, I guess, human nature or humanity's both capacity for tremendous violence and the tremendous resilience and empathy and sort of hope that you've also witnessed? I mean, do you try to reconcile those two? Have you been able to reconcile those two?
Isabel Allende, the great writer who wrote House of the Spirits and so many other great novels, once said that for every thug that opens fire in a community, there are 1,000 compañeros who will come to someone's aid. And that really is what gives me hope. That really is true. And so for all the horror that we see, there are so many good, fine people who are working hard to making the world a more just place. That's what gives me hope.
What always occurs to me in situations like that is, you know, you watch interviews with Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter or Ford or the people over the years that have been involved with this sort of thing, and or like the Fog of War film with Robert McNamara about the bombing of cities in World War II and Vietnam. You know, they seem in person just like regular people, nice people. And what's amazing is trying to figure out, well, how can this be? How can seemingly nice people order decisions that on the ground have such horrendous impacts? And I mean, that's true today for drone strikes or the war in Iraq. What are your thoughts on that? Like seemingly ordinary people or even respectable people in the media who seem like ordinarily, you know, just nice, lovely people can argue for things that the consequences on the ground for real life humans are just absolutely devastating.
That's why I think we can't focus on individuals. We need a media that gives voice to the movements that challenge this. It's not about one individual. The media opens the door or the window to let you see what's happening. People can be very insulated. And so they can say, I didn't know that was happening. That's our job in the media. And that's the terrible failure of the media today. The corporate media brought to you by the weapons manufacturers and the oil, the gas, the coal companies, the nuclear companies, the insurance industry. It's so circumscribed. You know, when there's a debate around whether the U.S. should go to war in Iraq, it's, you know, should we bomb by air or send in troops? What about those who say we shouldn't go to war at all?
Well, and it all seems so clean. It seems like a game.
And I think that the embedding process, you know, that's the process by which U.S. reporters and others embed in the front lines of troops has brought the media to an all-time low. The Pentagon developed that process, and they called it a spectacular success. They saw the power of the pictures getting out about Vietnam and how that influenced people at home. So what does President Bush do immediately? Banning taking photographs of flag-draped coffins, because people will respond. Americans are good people, like people are all over the world. So you don't show the pictures. But it is critical that we show those images. And the media has to be independent, not embedded in the front lines of troops. How do you think a reporter is going to feel when they're eating with the troops, sleeping with the troops, when your life is in their hands? If you're going to embed with the troops, you have to be in Iraqi hospitals, in Afghan communities, embed with the peace movement around the world to understand the full effects of war. It's our job to be at the target end, not to be the reporter, climbing into that tank to show everyone what the high-tech buttons are all about. What does it mean to be at the target of a drone strike? And that is very frightening. When people see these images, they say no. I really think even for 1 week, if we saw the images of war, if above the fold of every surviving newspaper was a photograph of a baby dead on the ground, telling her story, naming her, learning about who her family was, if the top of every radio and TV newscast told the story of a woman who was blown up in a drone strike in Yemen on the way to her wedding, if everyone's Facebook wall, every tweet, every email talked about a soldier dead and dying. For just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. We've got to show the images.
One of the things that always occurs to me when thinking about this is sort of putting myself in the shoes of a mainstream journalist, or trying to imagine what it would be like. And I think at least one of my theories is it's very hard to displease people. And, as humans, we're such social creatures. It's very hard to stand up to a crowd, or to stand up against prevailing sentiment. And if you were to show images, say, as an anchor, or write about it in the paper, a lot of people are going to be upset with you, both powerful people and people who just don't necessarily want to see it. It's so much easier just to talk about it in a more abstract way, and then you're not going to get the same sort of flack. Do you think sort of journalists understand that to be independent, it means in a lot of way to allow yourself to make powerful enemies, to not be liked, to sort of be shut out from the elite circles?
Our role is not to win a popularity contest. It's to do our job. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, was the only one explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. Journalists are essential to the functioning of a democratic society, and we have to take that role very seriously. I covered the White House. I would go to the White House press conferences. I'd be asking President Clinton about approving yet another sale of F-16 fighter planes to Indonesia. And other journalists would be smirking around me. In fact, the press secretary at the time, Mike McCurry, when I asked one of these questions, turned to me and said, "The turnip is dry." Now, I don't know if that was a secret message I was supposed to pass on to the Chinese, but everyone was snickering around me. So it doesn't just happen. There's this sort of relationship between the White House press corps and the politicians they cover.
Well, I've watched a couple of live press conferences, or caught them, and with Obama and before Bush. And what's amazing in watching it is it's also friendly. And the president often knows the journalist by name, and it's all very cordial and friendly. And I can imagine being in that situation. It's very difficult. It would be very difficult to, despite what the actual impact of policies can be, to say something that is challenging. There'd be so much, you don't want to cause a ruckus. You just want to get along.
Well, so often that is how journalists get ahead. Just to get that soundbite from the president or the vice president, it takes months of asking softball questions. And so the politician will know they're safe if you're called on. I call it the access of evil. Right. The axis of evil, the term that Bush coined to talk about countries like Iran and North Korea. Well, I talk about what journalists enjoy in Washington is the access of evil, trading truth for access. And I don't think it's worth it. The politicians need us more than we need the politicians.
Do you think there was ever an era where there was more of the philosophy of the importance of journalism and being independent and sort of challenging power, sort of being a muckraking journalist? Or do you think it's always just been an ebb and flow?
I think, there have always been great independent journalists, like I.F. Stone, the great muckraking journalist, who challenged those in power and taught students, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. I think he said if you remember 3 words, all governments lie. Now you have this revolving door of journalists going in and out of government. And, sometimes they're White House spokespeople and other times they're correspondents on the networks or they're consultants to a network. And it's not only they themselves, it's that they then create an atmosphere. There's a whole stable of them at these networks, and that sets the climate. There is a kind of coterie. In 2000, on election day, I had the experience of interviewing Bill Clinton. And it was very interesting. I didn't plan on it.
He called into, he was trying to get out the vote on election day, basically.
Right. And he was calling into New York radio stations. And I was at BAI. We were doing Democracy Now! And I got the call. The producers had already gone into the studio, and they said, and on the phone, it was right when we were going on the air. So I thought this must be some kind of breaking news call. So I really better pick it up. And they said, it's White House calling. And I thought they said the White Horse, which is this great historic tavern in the Village where Dylan Thomas drank himself to death. And they said the president would like to speak to you. And I thought they meant the president of the tavern. And I said, what is he doing first of all, I didn't know you had a president, but what is he doing calling at 9:00 in the morning? And then I said, the president of what? And they said, the president of the United States. So I didn't know if this was a hoax or not. And we were going on the air. So I gave the internal number and I ran onto the show. And they said he wanted to talk about getting out the vote. So we did the show. He didn't call. And afterwards, we went to get coffee because we knew this would be a long day. Like after midnight, we'd learn who was president. Well, in fact, it was 5 weeks later because this wasn't an election. It was a selection. It was Gore v. Bush. And it ended up being selected by the Supreme Court. But as we were walking out to get coffee, the Alternativa Latina music show was on, and they shouted that President Clinton was on the line. So I ran back in, and the host was completely paralyzed, his hands over the console, all the salsa music up, the faders, all the microphones down, and you hear President Clinton in the background shouting, "Is anyone there? Is anyone there?" So I threw my body over the console, threw all the music faders down, picked up all the microphones. So the whole room was hot, like 7 microphones. And it was me and our 2 producers and the music host and his producer. And I said, yes, President Clinton, we're here. I understand you're calling radio stations to get out the vote. Hillary Clinton was running for Senate and Al Gore was running for president. And I said, what do you say to people who feel that both the Democratic and the Republican Party are captured by corporations? And he responded. And then I asked him about Leonard Peltier. It's the first time he was being asked publicly. He was weighing clemency for Peltier, or that's what we had heard. He responded to that. And we both asked him about the napalming of the Puerto Rican island of Vieques by the U.S. Navy, asked him about the sanctions against Iraq. This had killed so many hundreds of thousands of people. This is before the hot war. Why 2 UN Assistant Secretary Generals had resigned, calling it the regime genocidal, the regime of sanctions. I asked him about Ralph Nader because he was running for president then, and wasn't President Clinton really responsible for his success by taking the Democratic Party to the right? And then he got really annoyed and he said something like, I find you hostile, combative, and at times disrespectful. So I said, so we just have a few more questions then. And I asked him about racial profiling because Al Gore had promised it would be his first act in office to issue an executive order banning racial profiling. But I said, you guys have been in office for 8 years. Why haven't you done it until then? Anyway, it was about a half an hour that we talked, and it was a great Latino music show that day. And the next morning we ran it on Democracy Now! And right afterwards, the White House called. And I was talking to a reporter from Newsday, the New York newspaper, on the phone. This is when we had, like landlines. And I was talking to him, and then I got another call. I said, just 1 second. I said, it's the White House. Let me call you back. He said, no, just put the phone down. I'll listen. So I picked up the White House call, and they said, you're banned from the White House. And I said, banned? But this goes to your question of the kind of relationship reporters have with those in power. And I said, why would I be banned? He called me. I didn't call him. And they said, we told you he had they said, you broke all the ground rules. I said, ground rules? I talked to you for 60 seconds when we were going on the air. What ground rules? And they said, we told you he wanted to get out the vote, and that's what he wanted to talk about. And something like question 1, 4, and 7 that you asked related to this, but nothing else did. I said, 1, 4, and 7? I asked that many questions related to that? Well, it sounds like you have a transcript. Could you send it? Because we would like to post it online. But number 2, I didn't agree to any ground rules. That might be what he wanted to talk about. That doesn't mean that's what I want to ask him. And they said, we also told you that he had a couple of minutes, and you talked to him for more than half an hour. I said, for God's sakes, he's the most powerful person on earth. He can hang up if he wants to. And I said, how many reporters did you talk to on election day? And she said, like 40. I said, and they all agreed to your so-called ground rules? She said, absolutely. They all sit on for like 2 or 3 minutes. That's right. And they asked him only about getting out the vote. That's right. So I said, it's a very sad comment on American journalism. Reporters on bended knee. And I said, I think we'll be around a lot longer than you guys will. Anyway, that was that conversation. And I hung up. And then I saw the other phone was off the hook. So I picked it up and I said to the guy, oh my gosh, I forgot you were on from Newsday. He said, I don't need to talk to you. I got everything I need. But it's that kind of, reporters being on bended knee that is not acceptable. We have a job to do, and we have to do it whether or not we are granted access.
I think what's sort of interesting about the profession of journalism, or the idea of journalism, is that to do the sort of work that Democracy Now! Does, or that you've done, or people like Seymour Hersh, it takes a sort of fine balance between, on the one hand, a tremendous sense of empathy and ability to feel for the suffering of others and want to tell their stories, and at the same time being able to be completely fierce in another way, because you have to be fierce in order to, I think, be actively disliked, or be willing to be actively disliked by a huge segment of the population, or at least by powerful interests.
I mean, there is nothing more profound than hearing someone speak for themselves and tell their own story, no matter how difficult that is. I started in radio, and I remember feeling that power of privilege that the microphone gives you. You walk into someone's house, and they open up, and how important that is. When we were in East Timor the first time, and coming back, talking to one of the networks who were thinking about going over, because that was very important to get a major network interested. They said, we're only going to do this if they're willing to go on tape and tell their story and what happened to their families and that they were killed. I mean, it wouldn't be hard to find people in Timor. There were over 200,000 Timorese who were killed during the Indonesian reign in East Timor, reign of terror. But people going on screen, that threatens their own lives, their families' lives, and we have a huge responsibility. The way the networks work and the newspapers work, where they protect the powerful by quoting unnamed sources. That was very much the case with weapons of mass destruction. The front page articles in the New York Times by Judith Miller, Michael Gordon, alleging weapons of mass destruction, always talking about unnamed individuals. That's protecting politicians, administration officials that don't want a lie traced back to them, but want to put it out there. And for journalists to comply with that, that's the kind of sourcing that should just not be allowed. But when someone is threatened, when their life or their livelihood is threatened, that's when it's appropriate to protect someone. And I feel a tremendous responsibility, especially in a situation where someone might not realize the power of the exposure. You don't achieve democracy. You have to be ever vigilant, fighting for it every single day. And the media is a key part of that. How do we learn about the rest of the world if we're either someone we know comes from another place, or we come from another place, or you learn about it through the media? And how does the rest of the world learn about us? Through the media. And it's got to be through something other than a corporate lens and a corporate microphone.
Just to end off, I read somewhere you were asked a series of short questions, like what's your biggest extravagance? I think you said coffee. And one of the things, and one of the questions was, what would improve your life the most? And you said, a weekend off. And I mean, Democracy Now! Is... I said that? Yeah.
I think I was misquoted.
Oh, really? It would seem to be plausible.
I do think that the weekend is a great accomplishment, just like the 40-hour work week. They are great goals to aspire to.
But, so Democracy Now!, I mean, it's an hour show every day. You have written 5 books in the past decade or so. Did I get that number right? 5?
I've written 3 of those books with my brother, who's also a journalist, David, and the last 2 are the books of columns, because we write a column every week for King Features.
And that's another thing. You write a column every week. You do promos for community radio stations. You have toured all across the country, giving speaking tours and things like that. What is your life actually like at this point? I mean, it must be completely consume your life doing the work you do.
But I am lucky enough to have a job that's something that I absolutely love to do. That I found at the beginning of my life in journalism, the independence that people strive to find all of their lives. And so it's a remarkable adventure every single day. The show is a magic moment every single day. We have classes come here at Democracy Now! And watch the broadcast in the morning. They sometimes get to ask the guests questions afterwards. Everyone from 4th graders to graduate students in journalism to foreign journalists who are traveling through this country. And so it is an amazing experience. When Pacifica Radio was founded, the network that I originally come out of, that was founded in 1949 by a war resister named Lou Hill, who came out of the detention camps and said there's got to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. He called Pacifica a noble experiment, and I continue to see the work we do in that way, trying our hardest to break the sound barrier, to bring out the voices of people who are working so hard in their daily lives to make a difference. I mean, I find it so inspiring. They're talking about incredibly difficult issues, but it's people who are doing something about them. So I'm incredibly lucky. And do you ever take a break, or do you ever get worn out? I mean, I read that you work most days from like 7 a.m. till midnight, or something like that. You keep a very hard schedule. Late that day, 7 a.m. The show is almost over. But no, I mean, I see sitting on my couch for 20 minutes is like a month on the Riviera. So if I get 40 minutes, that's 2 months. I mean, 2 months vacation in a year. That's terrific.
So you really don't need more? You don't.
Sometimes an hour is fantastic.
I mean, it must be exhausting at the same time, even if you do see it as important as you do, and it can be as gratifying as it is seeing the growth, but it must be also just tremendously exhausting at times.
I really do sleep sometimes. No, I do think it's important to do other things, because it's a way to exercise the imagination in another way, and
to step back and to do other things.
Mm-hmm. And I deeply value my family, my friends, the different communities I have the privilege of being a part of.
And to end off, I mean, it's clear you couldn't work as hard as you do unless you saw importance in it, and you saw that there can be change, there can be hope, and it actually can have an impact. Like we were saying earlier before, or you were speaking about, you had this sense from very early on, from even at your high school working at the newspaper. And I was wondering, for listeners of Democracy Now! Or viewers, or just concerned citizens, there's all these really enormous issues right now: climate change, economic inequality, things like the NSA and the surveillance state and the growing apparatus. And all these issues, they're so complex and they're so huge, and the institutions involved are so powerful and so ingrained that it can seem very hopeless in a way. It can seem like, how do you even start to take on these sorts of things? You obviously believe that they can change despite the enormity of them. So I was wondering what you would just say to people who do feel like it's too big and they don't know what role they can play or how to even start to work against these sort of massive systems.
That what you do really, really matters. I mean, look at Edward Snowden. Look what his act did. It has changed the discussion in the United States and all over the world of what kind of state we want to be, challenging the national surveillance state. That was one person who saw something terribly wrong, reached out to some very brave journalists, Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald, and he has rocked the world. Look at all of the people who marched against war in Iraq. Millions of people rocked the globe against war. Now, that war did take place, and Iraq is devastated as a result. But there is a growing movement around the world that unites people. I mean, we are able to communicate with each other through the internet, meeting people. Borders are coming down. There are very enormous challenges, that disparity between rich and poor ever growing in the United States, but so is awareness. And the fact that the world I'm in, the media can make such a huge difference if we continue to build it, to communicate with each other, that providing that forum, that common ground for people to begin to hear each other, for people to speak for themselves, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother or an uncle in Afghanistan, hearing from their experience, their view of the world. I really think that understanding is the beginning of peace. That's why I'm hopeful. I think that the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth.
And every small step or action someone takes, even if you can't see that it has an impact, it does? Would that be what you're... Not
only does an individual have an impact, but that inspires someone else, and that inspires someone else, and it makes a huge difference. I see it every single day. I'm inspired by people's everyday acts of bravery.
Well, in that same interview, you said, what's the lesson you've learned from life? And I think you said something like, fight like hell for what you believe in. So maybe that's a good message to end off on.
I think so. I think that people standing up for what they believe in, young people not giving into peer pressure, but doing what they think is just, standing up for someone who's being picked on. It starts when we're very young. I am lucky enough to have had parents who modeled that every day of their lives, and I thank them for that. I want to bring the history of all the different movements and the great people of the past, known and unknown, together with people today and the young people of the future, and not have young people feel that they have to recreate the wheel every time. There's such an incredible history of rich movements, dedicated, devoted movements, the women's movement, the abolition movement, the environmental movement, poor people also challenged in being able to have a voice. Just every day we have to fight for people to be heard, to have that voice, because that's what dignifies a life.
Well, I mean, Democracy Now! Has done such a great job of that over the years, and for so many of us watching, it's been that resource. So, thanks for doing what you do, and thanks for joining me today.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Kevin, for taking the time and coming to Democracy Now! And doing this interview.
Well, that was my conversation with Amy Goodman, the host of Democracy Now! And that's all for Radio Waves this week. As always, you can find us online. We're both on Facebook and Twitter. And you can check out our website at radiowaveshow.com, where we have all of our interviews. If you have any comments, you can get in touch with me. My email is kevin@thepublicradio.org. And if you like the show, consider leaving us a review in iTunes. It would be a big help and helps other people find out about the show. I'm Kevin Caners. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.